Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining IGI Cybersecurity's FAR compliance webinar today. So again, thank you for taking the time out of your day. Some rules of engagement here. We really want to make this as interactive as possible. So please fill out any of the question section here. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And Wayne or myself will do our best to answer them as they come in. So again, thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to our presenter today, Mr. Wayne Proctor.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Wayne Proctor with IGI. My main role is to work as a vCISO. I've been CISO for 7 different companies over the last 20 years, and now I really enjoy myself by working with IGI and help companies to mature their security programs. So you guys want to go to the next slide? So in today's agenda, we're going to go through these basic components. Really going to talk about why we're here today. Going to talk about why compliance with the FAR 52-204-21 baseline security controls is important to you. We're going to talk about those controls and talk about how really regulation on security for federal agency, civilian contracting firms is going to probably develop in the future. So hopefully you'll get a lot of good information out of this. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so taking you back a bit in history, back in 2016, I believe it was May, so almost 10 years ago, we had in the Federal Registry a rule published that going forward, all contracts with federal agencies for contracts that include FCI would require companies to become compliant with the 15 FAR baseline security controls that we're going to go through today. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, FCI is information not intended for public release. So you'd at first think, well, if this is federal contract information, FCI, and I have a contract with the government, then I must have FCI. And the vast majority of times that's true. But if there is a contract that is public, everything about it is public, then that's not FCI. So it's just keep in mind, not intended for public release. But as we all know, the vast majority of contracts with the government are not intended for public release. So that alone makes it FCI. Other things you can think of as FCI, not just the contract itself, but maybe SOWs, any deliverables from the contract. That's basically contract related information. So having that clause in there, so if you have a contract and you sign that contract with the government, and you have that clause in there that you have to be compliant, by signing that contract, you were stating legally that you have those controls in place because you signed the contract. So we're going to talk about the ramifications of that. But you basically, if you have a contract with the government issued since May of 2019, you have officially stated that you have these controls in effect. So there could be penalties if you don't. And just something to think about, there's been no process put in place to verify that you really have those controls in place. So it's likely a lot of companies don't, because there's just been no verification of it. The other thing I did want to let you know, you probably heard a lot in the news lately about CMMC. So that's a security requirement for contractors of the DoD. So that's not what we're here to talk about today, but I did want to let everyone know that the CMMC level 1 controls are exactly the same as the FAR baseline security standards that we're talking about today. So if you get these controls in place, or if you have these FAR 52204-21 controls in place, then you have the controls in place for CMMC level 1. So if you did want to officially say that you're CMMC level 1, that is a self-attestation, doesn't require a third-party assessor. So you could easily, if you have the proof that you have the baseline security standards in place for FAR, you could very easily, self-attest and have the evidence ready that you are level 1. And then you could also participate and win those DoD contracts. So it's just something to keep in mind, and we're going to talk a little bit more about CMMC overlaps in the end of this. Can you go to the next slide? All right, so I want to talk about some penalties. We said on the last slide that if you signed one of these contracts since 2016, and they had the clause in there that you need to be compliant with the baseline security standards, but you're not, there could be penalties. And there could be penalties under the False Claim Act, because the False Claims Act says that you cannot make any false certifications to the government. So by signing that contract that you have the controls in place, if you don't, there can be penalties. So let's just talk about some of those penalties. So there's civil penalties. So under civil penalties, every time that you send an invoice to the government and you didn't actually have the controls in place, you can be fined between $13,946 and over $27,000 per violation. That means every time you send an invoice, you would have to pay, for example, another $27,000. That can add up if you've sent a lot of invoices to the government. That can add up quickly. Also, on top of the civil penalties, you can pay treble damages, which you can think of as triple damages, but that's triple the actual damages. So if you have stated that you are compliant and you're not, that's basically a false claim to the government. So it could be possible that every single dollar you billed the government, say over the last year or 2 years, you billed the government $1 million. Treble damages would mean on top of those civil penalties, you would have to pay another $3 million, triple what you've billed. So that can be a major impact also to companies. And then you also have risk of suspension or debarment from future contracts with the government. And one thing that's not a full debarment from participating in those contracts, I talk about on the bottom of the slide. So if you did have any negative security issue, False Claim Act penalty, that would be entered into the government CPARS system. That's the Contract Performance Assessment Reporting System. So that's a system that all government procurement people are supposed to use before they award a contract. So if you're competing against maybe 3 other contractors and you have negative notes about your security in the system and your competitors don't, that puts you at a severe disadvantage. So that's another penalty of having these issues. Now, what could cause this? What could cause me to go through False Claims Act? One could be an audit. If the government does, or the agency you work for does any kind of audit, and they find out you don't have these controls in place, that could trigger the being sued under the False Claims Act. Also, way the government could zero in on you to actually do that audit is if you had a security breach. And we see information about security breaches every single day, literally. Just do a search on your web browser and you'll see lots of companies having security breaches. So if you had a security breach and the government agency you work for said that they noticed that you had a breach and they look into it, they may say, well, let's just do an audit because you had a security breach. That could also, if they find any problems with those controls, that could put you up for a False Claims Act fine. And then also, there could just be a whistleblower. So a whistleblower is someone that reports you. Someone, could be a contractor, could be, an employee, just anyone that reports you as not having control in place. They can get 15 to 30% of the total recovery amount also. So in our example before, you collected $1 million in fees from the government, but then your treble damages were $3 million. The person that reported this, could be getting 15 to 30% of that $1 million just for themselves, just for reporting you. So there's a lot of incentive for whistleblowers out there. And as this becomes more mature, more people are going to know about those incentives for whistleblowing. So there's a lot of risks there. Risks are increasing, and we're going to talk about that more on the other slides coming up. Can we go to the next? Yep. So this slide is not meant to explain in detail about the 15 security controls, but there's a summary of them here. And this is high level, just to all fit on one slide, high level information about these controls. And remember, these controls are exactly the same as the CMMC level 1 controls. Actually, the CMMC controls are based on these controls. So if you look at these, I'm not going to read every one, but you can see these cover things like access control, physical control, posting of information publicly, identifying, authorizing your users, so only people that should have access actually have it, sanitizing your media. So if you have FCI on any kind of media, and it can be even paper, but you have to make sure that you're destroying or cleaning out, sanitizing that media before it's reused. Your communications, you've got to make sure you have controls on that. You got to isolate public systems in your environment, repair system flaws, make sure you don't have security flaws in your systems, and if you do, fix those. Also malware, you have to make sure you're using malware properly, you're updating it, you're scanning as things come into your environment. So on the high level, you could look at that and say, oh, that's not so bad, only 15 controls. And it's really not terrible, but what we have to think about is that under each of these areas, there's a lot of requirements. There's details about what you have to do to comply with that area. So if we go to the next slide, just for one of the 15 controls, I've blown it out just so you can see how sometimes companies have misconceptions about what they have to do. So one of the controls, the safeguard number 12, that was on the last page, I summarized it as fix system flaws, but the actual statement is identify, report, and correct information and information system flaws in a timely manner. So that still doesn't sound so bad. And we've heard before, some customers and companies will say, oh yeah, I have mostly Windows systems and I run Windows Update. So it's patching my systems, I'm okay. So I want to take you through just quickly, what really has to be done to be compliant with this control. So you can see it's a lot more than you may think about. So the first thing just to keep in mind, and this is really applicable to all the controls, you've got to understand where your FCI is. So you could put these controls across your full environment, but you don't have to. To be compliant with the law, you only need to protect the systems that are in scope for FCI. So that's the first thing to do. You may want to deploy, your process to fix system flaws everywhere, or if you have an enclave, you have your FCI limited, so only a set number of systems are in any way able to get to the FCI, then you could do the controls just for those systems. So knowing your scope can be important. But the first step, like you see in that sentence, is identify. So how do you identify? Well, you could do vulnerability scanning. Don't just take the vendor's patches and apply them. Look at your systems, because a lot of times the security flaw is not a patch. It could be a whole new update of the system, update of the whole software, not just a patch. It could be a configuration update. It could be just a change to how you do things. But anyway, you got to identify your flaws, lots of different ways to do that. And you've got to do it not just on your endpoints, but you got to consider your SaaS offerings, if there's FCI over there, your network equipment. You're not going to patch your network equipment with a Microsoft patch. All but the OS you would. The most complicated one for most companies is third-party applications. So wherever that FCI is, you got to keep all those third-party applications, and companies, on their systems may have, 15 to 50 different applications running. Third-party in the industry now means not Microsoft. So non-Microsoft systems running in your environment, how do you keep them patched or updated? So after you find these flaws in the systems, you've got to communicate and track, internally that, hey, I found something. Let's manage this. Then you got to correct those flaws. And we said it's not just patches, could be updates to the software. For network systems, it's usually updating the firmware on those devices. You could make configuration changes. You could even do a compensating control, where maybe you just close some firewall ports, or change some isolation of the system. So a lot of different ways to correct your system flaws, but then you've got to track your progress, your remediation on correcting everything. If you have risk, you can't close something, you've got to get that risk signed off on by your management. So I know it took a while to go through that information, but it's important, I think, to realize that, a lot of companies just quickly think, oh yeah, I run Windows updates, so I'm good. There's a lot more to it. So that's just let you know, for all these 15 controls, you've really got to think that through. Okay, next slide. All right, so for here, I wanted to take you into some forward thinking, like what could happen beyond just the need to have your 15 controls for this VAR compliance put in place. So first, to give you a little bit of history, in 2021, there was an executive order that came out that said we must strengthen our cybersecurity requirements related to federal procurement. And that executive order was really the grandfather that really set out the road for a lot of the security programs that we have today, like what we're talking about, the FAR security requirements, CMMC, FedRAMP. So that's really kind of launched all these other things. And then the DOJ started their civil federal fraud initiative same year, riding on the back of the executive order, but they were able to say, with their initiative, what we're going to do is use the False Claims Act that already existed. We're going to make cybersecurity non-compliance a priority enforcement area. So we're going to specifically search out and go after companies that are lying about their security and their compliance with, a number of different requirements, but the FAR security requirements are one of the ones that they're looking at and applying the False Claim Act to. So that kind of got us to where we are today. But in the future, it's real important to understand that there's more change coming. So this is going to apply to our same audience today, to the federal civilian contractors. In January of last year, there was a proposed rule published, and it's called the FAR CUI rule. And I know we haven't talked about CUI much today, but that's, you can see in the bottom of the slide, controlled unclassified information, CUI. So it's basically sensitive information. It's not classified, but it's must be protected. And how it's been determined by the government that CUI must be protected by contractors is applying the NIST 800-171 controls, and that's what CMMC is built on. So it's basically saying that if you deal with CUI, then in the future, if this rule gets published, and right now it's on its second review public comment period, the expectation is by early 2027 that this will be law, that if you deal with CUI, then you also will have to be compliant with the NIST 800-171, and that will be a new clause going into all of your contracts. So with CUI, in general, CUI is what the government says it is, so which is not a great statement, but there is a CUI registry. You just type in your browser CUI registry. It's published and maintained by a government group called NARA, N-A-R-A. So you can go out and look at that, and that gives a detailed description of exactly what CUI is. It's fairly long. But if you get any documents today that in any way are labeled with CUI in any way, sometimes it also says the word controlled. But if you have any documents that say CUI, then you can be sure that you have CUI. But in the future, anything sensitive, it could be information about individuals, like PII information, or anything about a government program, a sensitive government facility. So basically anything the government wants protected and they feel it's sensitive, that's CUI. And if you have any of that, then you, in the future, probably 2027, are going to get contracts now saying that you're going to need to be compliant with 800-171. In 800-171, it's not 15 controls that you have to implement. It's objectives. So there's 110 controls, like there's 15 controls for what we have today with FAR, but there's 110 controls, and under them there's objectives. So in CUI compliance with 800-171, you have to have proof that you have every one of these 320 controls put in place. So it's a lot more complicated. So it's something to think about, that is coming. It's being reviewed. It's on its second review period. So, you may want to keep monitoring for that and see how it's changing, but that's going to very likely be a major impact on your operations. In the future, this is just why I have a picture of the crystal ball on the slide, is that, if we look in our crystal ball and we look at what happened with CMMC, we could say in the future, similar things may happen with this. You may have a self-reporting The DoD has a system called SPURS that their contractors are required to go out and rank themselves to show, how compliant they are with 800-171, because they realize you're not going to have it all in place day one. So, companies need to enter how compliant they are, but that's not been good enough. That's why we have CMMC today. Now it's required that companies have a third party auditing review by a C3 PAO of their operations to get certification that they really have these controls in place. Now, for this audience, if it's not till 2027 that you have to be compliant, and then you have to work towards it, we have several years potentially before you need to have it all in place. But that's something that if you already have these FAR 15 controls in place, a good next step is to look at how compliant you are with the 800-171 and make a roadmap to start getting there. Don't wait until the last minute, because then you'll be in a rush and it'll really be expensive and frustrating to have to do it all quickly at a large cost. So that's one recommendation you can take away. So let's see, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so thank you for your time. I'm going to hand back to Ken now, but I hope that that information was helpful.
Excellent. Thank you, Wayne. Just a quick reminder, any questions that you may have thought of while Wayne's going through that, please make sure you put it here in the chat box. I think we do have a couple in there, but I want to just touch a little bit here on how IGI is helping their clients navigate the complexities of the FAR compliance. We're coming in and just doing that gap assessment, right? Just getting that level set of where you are throughout that process, right? Kind of what Wayne was just saying. Start early, get a good roadmap, a good plan, POAM here, plan action and milestones. That way you can set it for these next year and a half, 2 years, so that way you're not jumping at the gun at the last minute, like what we're seeing on the CMMC front. Try to get ahead of it, avoid those penalties, avoid the time delay there. But that's really where we're driving and striving for clients is to start with the gap assessment, get an understanding of your environment, and work together with an organization like IGI or another to get a better understanding on the best path forward for you. Wayne, it does look like we do have a couple of questions that have come in. So I'm going to go ahead and go through those really quick. First one, I think I might have missed this one back when you were talking about the 15 different controls. So if they use antivirus software, does that mean that they're compliant in relation to that malware safeguard?
Well, it doesn't mean you're compliant if you use antivirus, but antivirus software can be used. It kind of matters how you implement it. But there's two basic controls in the malware section. So one is you have to run and scan for anti-malware on a regular basis. And then the other control is that you have to monitor real time as new files come into your environment. So like you get an email, you have to be scanning that as it comes in. As you get a USB file taken off the USB, it has to be scanned before you let it in your environment. So there's two different ways there. And you got to look across the whole environment. Anywhere where you could have any possible malware, you have to be doing the scanning. So anti-malware software could meet the requirement if you have it fully implemented properly.
Excellent. One other one, I think it's kind of based off what we were just talking about regarding the gap assessment, but even before that, they're coming to us for a gap assessment. question here is where should they even start? They don't even know, they're unsure of what their current compliance status is. What's your recommendation on, the first step?
Yeah, it really is the gap analysis to find out where you are and how much you have to do. It matters if you have security people in-house, but if you do, you could start doing your own gap assessment just to get a feel for where you are. A lot of companies don't have dedicated security people, or they have very few, so they look at outside company like IGI to help them with that. And it's also, there's a big value to you if you have an external security company to do that assessment for you, because then if you have to show as proof that of your gap assessment and that you're being thorough, you have a third party behind you saying, I looked at it, I'm a security professional, and these are the actual gaps, and this is my recommendation how to close them. So it's really a more thorough method to get you that information. But either way you do it, you really need to do that gap assessment. And I alluded to this before you do the gap assessment. I guess I should have mentioned this, but you really got to do that scope assessment. You got to know, well, what am I going to do a gap assessment on? Where is my FCI? What is in scope? What's not in scope? That's facilities, people, applications, hardware, service providers. Wherever this FCI is, that's possible that unless you're segmenting systems off, that it's in scope. And once you know that scope, then you can do that assessment. So those are the two first steps.
Excellent, excellent. And I think we have about two more questions. A new one just came in. Similar to CMMC, there's a lot of documentation that go into it. Do they need formal documentation to comply with this FAR 52204-21 baseline assessment or baseline safeguards, excuse me?
Yeah, that's, by the regulation itself, you do not have to have the documentation, but it's highly recommended. If you, for example, you have a government audit and they come in to check how compliant you are, if you have the documentation, it makes it a real easy process. You hand them the documentation, give them the evidence of your controls, and you'll smoothly get through that audit. If you don't, it can be a burdensome process. So you can be compliant and you don't have to have the documentation for this regulation, but if you do, it's much better for you.
Excellent, thank you. And then I know we talked about, being in 2027 is going to be the final rule. When do you expect it to be actually finalized?
Yeah, and that's just guessing. I think based upon everything I've seen, the earliest would be late 2026. More likely early 2027, but even that's a guess. If something big comes up and there's another public comment period, that'll delay it. But the consensus seems to be early 2027.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Wayne. That is all of the questions that are here. So I definitely want to thank everyone for joining and taking time out of your day. We will provide a copy of the webinar to you. Here's our contact information. So if you have any questions or any concerns, or just want to have a conversation around FAR compliance or any other compliance initiatives that you might be facing, feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to have a conversation.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Thanks. Have a great afternoon. Thank you, Wayne.